All right, A&P1 students. In this video, we are going to start talking about the microscopic anatomy of skeletal muscle cells. And so this hopefully image that's up will remind you of what we looked at when we were in Lab 3, and we were looking at different tissues under the microscope. And actually we looked at them as pictures instead of looking at them under the microscope. But hopefully you recall this tissue was the skeletal muscle tissue. And so the skeletal muscle cells, those are really long and cylindrical cells. So when you magnify them using the microscope, you can't get the whole cell in there, you just get like parts of the cell. So this is showing a part of a skeletal muscle cell. So this is like the plasma membrane here, the skeletal muscle cell, and then this is the other side of the plasma membrane. So we're seeing this section of the skeletal muscle cell, but realizing it continues way off the screen here. But again, we aren't able to get it in one view on the microscope when we magnify it, so because they're so long. And then hopefully you can see that they have these structures called nuclei. So they have, like a lot of our cells, like the generic cell we looked at in lab, just had one nucleus. But there are some cells that have more than one nucleus, some cells that don't even have a nucleus. But skeletal muscle cells have more than one nucleus. And the nuclei are generally kind of more at the periphery, kind of, at the edge, like right underneath the plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle cell. So you can kind of see them kind of crowding to the side. So they have multiple nuclei, and then they have these, they call them striations. It's these light and dark bands that you see across and they're going perpendicular to the long axis of this. Here's the long axis of our skeletal muscle cell. So you have these striations going perpendicular, and so that's the one of the characteristic features of skeletal muscle. And so we're going to talk about why we get these striations across there. So it has to do with the anatomy of our skeletal muscle cells. So you can see there, I was just kind of focusing on this one, but you can see there's part of another skeletal muscle cell, part of another one. So all right, so we are in our textbook here, but let me go back to our objectives. So we're on learning objective 5 here. So we want you to be able to identify the various parts of a skeletal muscle cell. And remember that another name for skeletal muscle cell is skeletal muscle fiber because of its long cylindrical shape. So these are the structures that we want you to be able to identify using a diagram of the skeletal muscle cell. One of these structures, it's actually a protein, so it's pretty tiny compared to these other bigger structures. So they don't show it on the diagram, but I wanted to put it in there so we don't forget about it because it's important in how the skeletal muscle functions. So it's myoglobin, and we need to know that it's there to store oxygen for that skeletal muscle cell or fiber. All right, so let's go back to our textbook and we'll look at our picture here, and I'll kind of describe the picture. So what they have done is they took a skeletal muscle cell or fiber, and they've cut off the end of it here, did like a cross section through it, so we can kind of see it end on. And we're also we can see it in this image from the side as well. So, okay, so these structures that are part of the skeletal muscle cell, they are similar to the parts that we learned about back in chapter 4 when we learned about the endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, ribosomes, nucleus, those things. But because the skeletal muscle cell is a little more unique, it has a specific function, they have changed the names a little bit. So as we go through here, I'll refer, and actually it looks like I can see this one, they kind of put in parentheses what that represents. So, so the first part of the skeletal muscle cell that we need to be familiar with is the plasma membrane. But again, it has a special name in the skeletal muscle fiber. So they call it the sarcolemma. So sarcolemma, and sarco is a prefix that means flesh. And so that's where they get that so you'll see that sarco word prefix quite often. So the sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of any skeletal muscle cell. And it has special functions, so that's kind of why we don't just call it a plasma membrane, we call it a sarcolemma. And then if you look inside the skeletal muscle cell, there are organelles in the skeletal muscle cell that are just unique and only found in skeletal muscle cells. And they are called myofibrils. So myofibrils. So you can see them, they're long and cylindrical, just like the skeletal muscle cell is long and cylindrical. It's made up of these long cylindrical myofibrils. So we have a bunch of those bundled together inside the skeletal muscle cell. And you can see they take up like 80% of the space in our skeletal muscle cells. So they're pretty important structures for contraction. So we'll focus on their anatomy further a little bit later. So those are the myofibrils. And then you can see kind of spaced between here, those hopefully look like mitochondria. They have kind of that look of the mitochondria, but each one of those is a mitochondrium. So those are part of our skeletal muscle cells where ATP is made. We'll talk about ATP's role in muscle contraction later. And then, of course, the nucleus, they have one here and then one over here. But again, see how it's kind of pushed to the side, like the myofibrils are taking up most of the space. And so the nucleus gets pushed to the periphery, just like right underneath the sarcolemma. Oh, we got another one here. So those are our nuclei, since it's multinucleated. The next structure that you will see that's, again, not something that you see in other cells, and that is this kind of blue kind of mesh that you see that's surrounding. It's kind of hard to, you can see it on the surface of the myofibrils here. You can kind of see it completely surrounds these myofibrils, and that blue mesh is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So we learned about the endoplasmic reticulum. So these have a special role. So we call them sarcoplasmic reticulum rather than endoplasmic reticulum. So that kind of blue mesh that you see, netting, I guess you could say, is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then if you'll notice, it's a little, I think it's a little hard to tell, but I'm going to see if I can zoom in on this, see if it'll show. So hopefully you can see that our sarcolemma, it has holes in it. So there's like a hole there, there, there. And those holes are actually canals, or like little tubes, I should say, because that's how they describe them. And so those little openings are connected to these green tubules. So right here you can see the hole in the sarcolemma. Here they took the sarcolemma away, so all you can kind of see is just the opening where the hole is going to lead to. So the hole leads into these tubules. And so the green that you see here, all of those are called transverse tubules. So those are our transverse tubules, and I'll go back out here. So the green there is the transverse tubules. So they have here, and they'll sometimes just abbreviate them T tubules. So you can call them that too. But they essentially, there's these little holes in the sarcolemma, so that it's kind of like the T tubules or transverse tubules are kind of extensions of the sarcolemma. And that allows for the sarcolemma to actually extend into the center of the muscle cell. And so they're not only just here, but they're deep within around these myofibrils. So they don't just stay on the outside here. All right. And the other part of our that we need to know anatomy-wise is the little space that's between all these organelles that we just described is called the sarcoplasm. So again, usually we call it cytoplasm in our generic cells, but again, since this is a special skeletal muscle cell, they call it sarcoplasm. So it's kind of just this, space between all the organelles, between the myofibrils and mitochondria, sarcoplasmic reticulum. All right, so I'm going to go back to our objectives here. So we talked about the sarcolemma, the transverse tubules, sarcoplasms, sarcoplasmic reticulum, the nuclei, the mitochondria. We already talked about the myoglobin earlier. Can't see it on the picture, but need to know it stores oxygen for skeletal muscle cells. And then the myofibrils. So we have covered the anatomy for at least the first section of anatomy that we're going to cover. So these are our kind of like our cellular parts, but we're going to go and dig a little deeper into the anatomy, and we're going to specifically identify the parts that make up the myofibril, because these myofibrils are the units that are going to cause muscles to contract and work. So they're pretty important. So we want to know what they're made up of. So I'm going to do that in the next video. But in this video, make sure that you learn these parts and you're familiar with them, and you can visualize them when we say these parts, because it's going to be these parts that we talk about when we talk about how the physiology of a skeletal muscle goes. And if you don't know the anatomy, you're going to be lost with the physiology. So this week we got to focus on our anatomy, microscopic anatomy of skeletal muscle cells, so we can fully understand the physiology. So I'll see you in the next video.